At the end of May 2026, according to local reporting out of Albuquerque, New Mexico, vendors at a food truck park there began posting the same message to social
Delish.
media within days of each other. The park was closing. Not next year, not next quarter. By the end of the month, according to that reporting, the Albuquerque Food Park had been open for roughly 3.5 years, according to the same reporting. It started as the Pacific Rim Food Park, built on a lot owned by a church, Grace Church ABQ, that reportedly had no immediate use for the land at the time. Vendors specializing in Asian and Latin American food built loyal followings there. Regulars became friends. By the account given in local coverage, the park was a working, well-liked business right up until the announcement. Then, according to that reporting, the church sold the lot. The vendors were reportedly given until the end of the month to leave, with little advance notice and no say in the decision, according to statements they posted publicly at the time. This is the part of the food truck business that rarely makes it into the food truck content. Nobody films the sale of a parking lot, but if that account is accurate, that sale did more damage to that business than a bad review, a slow month, or a competitor ever could have. Strip away the string lights and the menus, and every food truck park eventually comes down to one question nobody puts on the sign out front. Who owns the dirt? The way I see it, a food truck park is best understood not as a food business, but as a real estate position wearing a hospitality costume, one where the parking lot underneath it usually belongs to somebody else. Start with what a food truck park actually sells, because it is not food. In the typical vendor-driven food truck park, the park owner does not cook the food being sold by the trucks, does not buy the truck's inventory, does not hire the line cooks, or lose sleep over a surprise health inspection during someone else's lunch rush. That risk sits with the vendors, the people who own the trucks. What the park owner is usually selling looks closer to what a shopping center sells: a location, a crowd, and infrastructure. Water hookups, electrical service heavy enough to run a dozen commercial kitchens at once, drainage, restrooms, shade, seating, security. Permits that have to be renewed and defended. The vendors pay for the right to park there, usually structured as a pad fee, charged daily, weekly, or monthly. That is the park's core revenue. It is also, and this matters, the smallest piece of what a genuinely profitable park actually earns. Here is why. A 2026 food truck profitability guide published by foodtrucklease.com puts average annual food truck revenue at around $346,000, with net profit margins of about 6 to 9%, once food cost, labor, fuel, and maintenance come out. That is a single industry publisher's estimate, not an audited or government figure, and it should be treated that way. But even that single estimate illustrates the basic problem. Food trucks operate on thin margins, which puts a real ceiling on what any park can charge for a pad. Owner-operators who skip hired labor might clear a bit more, closer to 10 or 15% by some accounts. Either way, a truck cannot easily hand over a large share of its revenue in rent and still survive the season. So, if pad fees were the whole business, most parks would be landlords collecting modest rent from tenants who cannot pay much more. And that describes a lot of struggling parks perfectly well. But the parks that make real money figured out something else. They stopped thinking of themselves as a parking lot for trucks and started thinking of themselves as a bar that happens to have trucks parked outside it. Walk through the numbers on a built-out park, the kind with a real beverage station or a licensed bar. TheTruckChef.com, an industry guide that profiles food truck park operations, describes beverage sales as often the single highest margin line in the business, in some cases exceeding every vendor's pad fee combined. That is one publisher's characterization of the industry, not a verified financial statement from any specific park, and a serious documentary treatment should say so on screen. But the underlying economics are straightforward. A drink program can carry dramatically higher gross margins than a food operation, because it isn't absorbing the same ingredient, preparation, and kitchen labor costs. A truck carries on every plate. A truck has to buy meat, produce, oil, packaging, and pay someone to stand over a flat top for 8 hours straight. A park's own drink stand buys syrup, ice, cups, and maybe a keg. A park is rarely competing head-to-head with a food truck's economics when it runs its own bar, because it is not really selling food at that point. It is selling proximity to food and thirst. This is the pattern that shows up again and again across operator accounts of the industry. The trucks are usually the reason people show up. In many built-out parks, the beverage program is what turns that foot traffic into the operator's actual profit. It changes how you should picture the whole operation. Do not picture a strip of parking spaces. Picture a venue that has outsourced its entire kitchen to a dozen or more independent contractors, none of them on payroll, all of them absorbing food cost risk the venue itself never has to touch. The park captures the crowd the trucks generate, then monetizes that crowd through a channel none of those trucks can compete with. None of this means the park owner is playing it safe, though. The truckchef.com puts built-out site infrastructure, utilities, amenities, and improvements at around $553,000 for a fully developed park, which is the source behind the roughly $500,000 figure used here. Again, that is a single industry publisher's estimate rather than a verified construction budget, and actual costs vary enormously by market and by how much of the beverage build-out is included. Paving. Utility hookups sized for commercial kitchen loads. Drainage, a liquor license, and a bar build-out if the beverage program is part of the plan from day one. That is real capital sunk into dirt before a single dollar of revenue exists. And once the doors open, the bills do not care whether business is good. Rent or mortgage payments, utilities, insurance, a security and cleaning staff that has to scale up on Friday and Saturday nights whether the trucks pull a crowd or not. These are fixed costs, the kind that arrive at the same size in a slow month as they do in a great one. And they are, according to operators tracking real sites, often in the tens of thousands of dollars every single month. Every operator guide covering this business repeats the same warning in slightly different words. Pad fees alone, even from a fully occupied lot, usually do not cover that fixed overhead. The park needs the beverage program, the private events, the sponsorships to actually clear its costs and turn a profit. Which means the flashiest, most optional sounding part of the business is the part actually holding the whole structure up. That is the first contradiction worth sitting with. The safest revenue stream, the pad fee, is too small on its own to matter. The riskiest sounding revenue stream, a bar with a liquor license and a staff to run it, is what keeps the lights on. But there is a second contradiction buried underneath that one, and it is the contradiction that actually kills these businesses. Before we go further, it helps to see the shape of this industry across its different sizes, because the risk profile changes completely depending on how far an operator commits. At the entry level, someone with an empty lot, a church, a flea market, a vacant commercial property lets trucks park for a modest fee with almost no site investment beyond basic power access and a few portable restrooms. Capital outlay can be as low as the low 5 figures. This looks like the easiest way into the business, and it is exactly the model that produced the Albuquerque story. Thin investment, thin commitment, and total exposure to whatever the landowner eventually decides to do with the property. At the professional level, an operator builds a purpose-designed park. Dedicated utility hookups, paved surfaces, permanent restrooms, shade and seating infrastructure, active, deliberate vendor curation instead of just filling empty pads. Usually a real beverage program. This is the roughly $500,000 and up tier, and it is where a park starts behaving like a genuine hospitality business rather than a lot with some trucks parked on it. At the institutional level, an operator runs multiple sites or vertically integrates by also manufacturing or financing the trucks that fill those pads. This tier carries the most leverage, the most complexity, and, as it turns out, a completely new category of risk that has nothing to do with how well any individual park is run. Which brings us to the second failure mechanism, the one hiding inside that institutional tier. Albuquerque answers who owns the dirt one way: somebody else entirely, a landlord with no stake in the food truck business at all. The next case answers it a different way, and it is the more unsettling version, because this time the property itself was reportedly tied to the operator's own company. Boardwalk on Bulverde opened as one of San Antonio's original food truck parks, run by a company called Cruising Kitchens, which was also, according to local reporting, one of the country's larger builders of custom food trucks and trailers. The company reportedly built trucks for individual entrepreneurs as well as major corporate clients, with local coverage naming Walmart, H-E-B, Whataburger, and Raising Cane's among them. For a while, according to that coverage, this looked like the smart version of the business. Instead of just renting pads, the same company financed the very trucks that filled them. Boardwalk on Bulverde had already been through one closure before this, back around 2015, when, according to reporting at the time, the property owner needed the land for something else. It later reopened, renovated, with new amenities, the kind of upgrades that suggested confidence in the concept. Then, according to reporting on a Chapter 11 bankruptcy filing around January of 2026, Cruising Kitchen's liabilities were listed at roughly $18.2 million against about $3.4 million in assets. The filing reportedly indicated no funds would be available for unsecured creditors. That same reporting described lawsuits from customers and lenders alleging undelivered trucks and unpaid deposits, and cited claims that the company had ordered far more truck inventory than it could deliver as part of a large supply arrangement. Those are allegations described in court filings and news coverage, not findings this documentary can independently confirm, and they should be read that way. Here is the part that matters specifically for a documentary about food truck parks. According to that same reporting, a lender pursuing the company separately moved to foreclose on properties tied to the business, including the Boardwalk on Bulverde site itself. If that account holds up, the park was not the thing that failed. Its jeopardy came from a separate business line, truck manufacturing and financing, that reportedly shared an owner and a balance sheet with the park. When the manufacturing side ran into trouble, debt obligations tied to that trouble reached over toward the real estate too. This is the kind of exposure that can appear when a company is vertically integrated without separating the risk. Manufacturing and financing trucks for other people is a capital-intensive, inventory-heavy business with its own failure modes. Large purchase orders, large receivables, large exposure the moment a big supply deal sours. Operating a food truck park is a real estate and hospitality business with a different risk profile, closer to running a small shopping center than a factory. Fuse the two under one balance sheet, and, at least in this case, trouble born in one business reached toward an asset in the other. Line these two cases up, and they turn out to represent two different risks, not one repeated lesson. Neither account points to food quality, a health code violation, or a management team that lost control of costs, so rule those out first. Albuquerque is a story about never controlling the land in the first place. The operator built something people loved on someone else's ground and lost it the moment that landowners' plans changed, regardless of how the business was performing. Boardwalk on Bulverde is closer to the opposite problem. This operator had built and controlled real, valuable real estate over a decade, then put that asset at risk by tying it, through shared ownership and shared debt, to a separate, riskier manufacturing business. One operator never had a claim on the land. The other had a real claim and leveraged it away. It is worth pausing here on why intelligent, capable people keep walking into the first version of this trap. Because the psychology matters as much as the balance sheet. The entry-level version of this business is genuinely cheap to start. An empty lot and a handshake with a landowner is a low barrier compared to almost any other real estate venture. That low barrier attracts operators who never intend to formalize the arrangement, because formalizing it costs money and slows down opening day. The fantasy, and industry writers use almost exactly this language, is a modest investment producing outsized returns with total flexibility. The reality is a business that only becomes structurally safe once an operator either owns the land outright or negotiates a lease with real legal teeth. And both of those options cost more time and capital than most first-time operators want to spend before they have proven the concept works at all. So operators rationally, understandably, start informal. And the informal version is precisely the version most exposed to a landowner's future plans. The second version of the trap looks nothing like carelessness, which is what makes it more interesting. An operator who has already succeeded, who owns real infrastructure and a proven site, faces a different pull. The temptation to use that asset as leverage to grow faster, whether by expanding into manufacturing, financing other people's trucks, or simply borrowing against a property that has finally proven its value. Cheap capital and a growth story make that expansion look rational at the time, not reckless. The danger is not that the second business is a bad idea on its own. It is that cross-collateralizing it with the park quietly turns the park's own real estate into collateral for someone else's risk. Now look at what a different set of choices produces, because there is a version of this business that has largely sidestepped both failure paths, and the solution was never a smarter beverage program or a tighter vendor contract. It was a decision made before the first truck ever arrived. World Food Trucks sits along Highway 192 in Kissimmee, Florida, on the grounds of the Visitors Flea Market, an existing tourist market roughly 10 minutes from Walt Disney World, according to the park's own marketing and the property listing at that address. Orlando Weekly, covering the park in 2025, described it as Central Florida's first permanent food truck park, and reported more than 50 vendors on site at the time. More recent marketing from the park itself puts the number over 100. Vendor counts at a site like this shift constantly as trucks rotate in and out, so treat the exact figure as directional rather than fixed. But by any account, this is one of the largest single sites of its kind in the country. What makes this park different is not that it cracked the business model everyone else struggles with, it sidestepped the hardest part of the model entirely. Every park in this documentary has had to fight for foot traffic, build a following from nothing, and hope word of mouth carries it through a slow season. World Food Trucks never had to fight that battle. It attached itself to a flea market that already existed, on a highway carrying a permanent, constantly renewing stream of tourists heading to and from one of the most visited destinations on the planet. It did not need to become the reason people showed up. It only needed to be a good enough reason for tourists who were already there to spend an extra hour and a meal. This is the least discussed advantage in the entire industry, and it has nothing to do with pad fees or beverage margins. It is site selection solving the demand problem before a single dollar of operating capital gets spent. A park with 50 or 100 vendors creates its own gravity too, once it exists. More cuisines mean more reasons to visit, which draws more vendor applications, which lets the operator be selective about the mix instead of just filling empty pads with whoever shows up first. But that flywheel only started spinning because the location already had traffic no marketing budget could have manufactured from scratch. Neither the Albuquerque Park nor Boardwalk on Bulverde had that advantage. They built loyal audiences the hard way, one visit at a time, on land that never fully belonged to them, either legally or through the traffic patterns of a destination that existed before they arrived. World Food Trucks solved the land problem differently. It did not solve land ownership. It solved land relevance. Even a landlord decision at that site would carry a very different kind of risk, because the site's value comes from its position on a permanent tourist corridor, not from years of goodwill one operator built from nothing. There is also a financing story underneath all of this that most food truck content skips entirely, and it explains why some operators end up owning their land while others end up exposed the way Albuquerque's operator was. Financing in this business generally takes one of three shapes. The first is an SBA-backed real estate loan. The SBA's own 504 program, according to the agency's official program description, can finance the purchase of land and existing buildings, new facility construction, and the improvement of land, streets, utilities, parking lots, and landscaping through a long-term, fixed-rate structure delivered with a certified development company partner. That is the program used by operators who want to purchase and improve the land outright, and it is about as close as this industry gets to a stable, bank-grade capital structure. The second shape is a straight ground lease, where the operator finances only the site improvements and pays rent on land somebody else owns. The third shape is the hybrid cruising kitchens represents, where a single company finances trucks for outside vendors while simultaneously operating park real estate, cross-collateralizing two very different businesses under one roof. The mechanism matters more than the label. Under real ownership, the operator captures the full upside if the site appreciates, but also absorbs the full downside if the location underperforms. There is no landlord to blame and no landlord who can pull the rug. Under a ground lease, risk transfers in the opposite direction. Entry capital is lower, but every dollar spent on paving, utilities, and build-outs is effectively financing an asset someone else owns, and the lease term becomes the true limit on how long the business can exist, regardless of how profitable it is. Under the hybrid model, a liquidity problem in the trucks and financing side of the business can trigger foreclosure proceedings against the park real estate even while the park itself is generating positive cash flow, which is exactly the mechanism visible in the cruising kitchens filing. There is an operational layer underneath all of this that rarely shows up in a documentary, but it explains why the businesses that survive tend to be run by people who treat the site itself as the product, not the trucks. A site manager has to coordinate a rotating schedule of vendors and deliberately balance the mix breakfast, lunch, dinner, dessert across enough cuisines that no two vendors compete for the same customer. Stack 3 taco trucks next to each other, and all 3 quietly cannibalize each other's sales, which eventually shows up as one of them failing to renew its pad agreement. The utility load behind the scenes is bigger than it looks from the parking lot, too. Running a dozen or more independent commercial kitchens simultaneously, each with its own fryer, refrigeration, and ventilation, draws far more power and water than a typical retail lot was ever built to handle, which is part of why site infrastructure costs run so high before a single truck arrives. Waste and grease disposal need their own contracts too, since food service waste carries regulatory handling requirements a normal commercial lease would never anticipate. The onboarding cycle never really stops either. Every time a truck rotates in or out, permits, insurance certificates, and health inspections all have to be re-verified before that pad can generate revenue again. And the single highest consequence event in daily operations is not a slow Tuesday. It is losing one high-volume anchor truck. Operator guides note that losing a single strong vendor does not just cost that one pad fee, it measurably drags down overall foot traffic, which then hits the beverage program. And the event bookings the model depends on to clear its fixed costs. Step back now and look at who actually captures the value in this business, because it is not who most people assume. The customer wins on price and variety compared to a sit-down restaurant, but has no stake in any of this beyond the meal directly in front of them. The vendor, the person who owns the truck, carries the heaviest operational risk in the chain. Food cost, labor, health inspections, equipment breakdowns that can sideline a truck for a week. All for a margin industry data puts at roughly 6 to 9% net, sometimes higher for a true owner-operator working the window alone. On top of that thin margin, the vendor holds the least structural power in the relationship. Switching costs are low. A truck can drive to a different lot, which sounds like freedom, but strips vendors of leverage. Since the park operator knows there is always another truck waiting for an open pad. Vendors can be displaced by a change in the park's curated mix, or by a landlord's decision to sell the ground the park sits on, and in both stories here, they found out last. The park operator can capture some of the best economics in the visible business. No food cost exposure. A beverage program can carry margins that are difficult for a food truck's full food operation to match. Event rentals. Sponsorship stacked on top of contracted pad rent. Pricing power sits here too, once a park becomes an established destination, because vendors need the location's foot traffic more than the operator needs any single vendor, particularly with a waitlist of applicants behind every occupied pad. But the operator's entire position rests on one condition: continued access to the land. Remove that, and every dollar of built infrastructure, every relationship with every vendor, every ounce of brand loyalty built up over years becomes worthless overnight, which leaves the landowner or lender In both cases examined here, that party never built a truck, never managed a vendor relationship, never ran a beverage program. And in both cases, a decision made for reasons that had nothing to do with the food truck business ended the operation anyway. A church selling an unused lot, a lender foreclosing on collateral. Neither was trying to run a food truck park into the ground. They were exercising ownership, and in this business, ownership appears to carry more weight than operational skill. Compressed into a single sequence, the pattern looks like this. A landowner decides to sell, redevelop, or reclaim a site, or a related business under shared ownership runs into financial trouble. That decision removes the park's access to its own location, or triggers a claim against it. Vendors get short notice and scatter, taking their revenue with them. Depending on lease terms, an operator may be able to remove improvements, negotiate a buyout, or claim some contractual value. But in the two cases examined here, there is no indication either operator recovered meaningful value from what they had built. The practical result: an operator can lose much or all of the economic value of the capital, sunk into paving, utilities, and build-outs. Compare that to the failure story most people assume drives a park under. A bad location, a weak vendor mix, fixed costs slowly outrunning pad fee income. That mode is real too, but it is survivable. The kind an attentive operator can see coming and correct for. Losing the ground itself gives no such warning. So go back to Albuquerque to those vendors posting the same message within days of each other. The end of the month. Then hold that image next to Boardwalk on Bulverde, a park with real, controlled, renovated real estate dragged into a foreclosure fight anyway because of debt sitting one balance sheet away. Read together, those two stories are not the same warning repeated twice. They are two different ways the ground can move. In the way I see it, a food truck park behaves like a real estate position wearing a hospitality costume. The trucks provide the crowd. In the parks that work, the bar and the events provide much of the margin. But an operator can lose that business either by never holding a real claim on the land at all, or by holding a real claim and then letting something else reach through it. The final equation for this business, then, is not really about pad fees, or beverage margins, or occupancy rates, even though those are the numbers every operator watches every single day. Revenue and margin measure how well the business runs. They say nothing about who can end it. That second question comes down to the structure sitting underneath the cash flow. Who owns the land, how long they control it, how the site's improvements were financed, and what other liabilities, if any, can reach that property from somewhere else. Profitability looks necessary. Based on these two cases, it does not look sufficient. The striking thing about both cases in this documentary is that neither business necessarily failed because the underlying operation was bad. By the accounts available, the trucks were good, the crowds were real, and in at least one case, the park's own numbers held up. What made both businesses vulnerable were two different weaknesses in the structure above the operation itself. One, a missing claim on the land, the other, an exposed claim on it. Either way, the question that decided the outcome was never about revenue or margin or how good the tacos were. It was the same question this whole business always comes back to, the one that rarely shows up on a financial statement at all. Who owns the dirt?